the last day, and we'll start on time on the last day of our conference too. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our second keynote speaker, Pieter Judson. I probably don't need to introduce him, but I'll still say a few words about him. Peter is a professor and chair of the Department of History at the European University Institute in Florence, and he's the author of several works that explore topics that we are talking about at this conference, that explore the ideas of nationhood, empire, and of course identification in Catholic Central Europe. One of the books that really changed the debate was his Guardians of the Nation, Activists on the Language Frontiers of Imperial Austria, 2006. If you haven't read it yet, you really do have to. And his latest book, of course, is the best-selling The Habsburg Empire, A New History, published in English last year. At the beginning of this year, the German translation was already published, and several other translations are in preparation. And I might add, the Slovene translation is also being prepared. We actually have the translator in the audience.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah. So, Peter, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to come to Ljubljana. I've been to many parts of what you could call Habsburg Central Europe, and this is one of my favorites as an outsider. And I apologize that we have the computer up here, but my text is here, and I didn't want to sit. I also must apologize for the abstract character of my talk this morning. The best thing about being an historian is that you can uncover strange stories around which you can build a historical narrative. So, for example, that book, Guardians of the Nation, it's not a fun thing to write a book, but that book was the most fun to write because I found such strange stories and such unexpected stories that I could use them in a narrative to say something bigger. Whereas the Habsburg Empire book, there are stories in it, but not so much fun. Anyway, unlike the excellent case studies that we heard yesterday and that we will hear today, my talk will be more about ideas and approaches, and I apologize for that because I know you'd rather have stories. But I'll at least start with a local story that shows that what 19th century national activists believed and asserted about categories of identity rarely reflected local forms of identification. In 1898, the Transylvanian Association for Romanian Literature and the Culture of the Romanian People, commonly known as ASTRA, held its annual meeting in the small town of Beus in Bihor County. ASTRA, as many of you know, established branches across Transylvania and eastern Hungary, although not without difficulty. Its activists promoted primarily literacy, they created small local libraries, and they sponsored public lectures on cultural topics. But with very limited money and a very narrow social base, not to mention hostility from some government officials, ASTRA was hardly the kind of mass nationalist movement that we know from the Austrian half of the dual monarchy. But it was a nationalist organization. The town of Beus had only just organized its own ASTRA branch, so the decision to hold the annual meeting there was an attempt by Romanian nationalists in Transylvania to encourage more local activism. Now, this small example is interesting because of the radically different ways that the local, regional, and national media described this ASTRA meeting. First, the local media. Bihor County's Hungarian language newspaper praised the Astra meeting. They praised its important work, its achievements, and its leaders' quote, restrained speeches. According to this Hungarian newspaper, Astra's members were, quote, sober-minded, Romanian-speaking, but Hungarian citizens, quote, who should be praised for their contribution to, quote, the progress of our Hungarian homeland, end quote. Many miles away in Budapest, however, a nationalist newspaper criticized this very same meeting as nothing more than, quote, a Romanian demonstration, end quote. Referring to an earlier demonstration elsewhere, the paper accused the Astra members of, quote, regularly trampling the Hungarian flag in the mud, end quote. Now, from an altogether different perspective, a Romanian journalist from Bucharest who attended the meeting approved of the ways that Astra, quote, reawakened the spirit of Romanian national culture, end quote. But he also was a bit worried. He warned that the local language of the Romanians included too many Hungarian words, and that the local Romanian leaders had too close a relationship to the local Hungarian leaders. So, from far away, at least, Bihor County did not inspire confidence among any nationalists, and this is the conclusion of Robert Nemes, from whom I stole this story. For the paper in Budapest, the Astra meeting was a dangerous example of Romanian irredentism, while the paper in Bucharest worried that Astra was too Hungarian. But up close, the meeting looked very different again. Up close, the efforts of the local Astra activists to increase literacy among Romanian speakers was considered an important part in the progress of the larger Hungarian nation. And in the 19th century, as we know, progress was the most desirable of phenomena for any nation or empire. So this is only one story about how local activists identified with nation differently from the way that newspapers in the capital cities understood nation. Many of those stories question the old presumptions we traditionally learned about the meanings of nationalism in the Habsburg monarchy. We cannot understand what nation meant to people in the 19th and 20th centuries in a period of developing mass politics if we do not explore the varieties of meanings that participation in national organizations held at the level of the neighborhood, or the village, or the region. These explorations often show us that the nation portrayed by the urban media and the politicians meant very little to people compared to other important forms of community belonging. More importantly, these explorations show that simple categories of identity, such as Hungarian or Romanian, identities that I think implied political programs, these identities had very little to do with local identifications. Did joining Astra mean you believed in irredentism? Did it mean fostering local literacy? Did it improve your social life? A simple examination of identity categories cannot answer this question. So the conference here is about the relationship, I think, this is what I think our conference is about, the relationship between how human beings see themselves and how authorities of all kinds see them, same people. So how humans see themselves and how other people see the same people. It's about identifications and it's about identities. Now, although these two words sound very similar in English, they actually mean very different things. Identities are categories that serve to represent social realities by simplifying them. Identities take some common traits, like being a vegetarian, and transform these traits into categories that should describe whole communities of people. Identifications, on the other hand, I think, are choices made by people about the groups or categories to which they wish to belong. Those identifications made by real people can, of course, change quickly with different situations, or they might remain strong for long periods of time. More simply, identification is a process, but identity is a category. The two are not equivalent terms. We can't simply replace identity with identification. So we could say this conference is about the space between these two words, the space between how people understand their own experience on the one hand, and how institutions seek to organize, categorize, manage, and explain that human experience on the other hand. This is a very important space or gap, especially since we often make identities, rather than the people who identified with them, into history's actors and agents. So often, and I am the first person to do this, let me say. For example, in our historical narratives, who do we treat as the agents, as the actors, when we tell a large story in a lecture to a class of people maybe who don't have any background? I would say we investigate historical situations. We treat the abstract categories of social groups as the actors that together make the historical change, as if abstract categories could experience motivations and then take action. Ever since the rise of social history in the 1960s and 1970s, which used to seem recent and now is actually centuries away from us, we have treated different kinds of abstract categories such as industrial workers, peasants, middle classes, Catholics, Jews, women, as actors in history and as the agents of change. Thanks to the cultural turn, as well as to post-colonial scholarship, we also include other kinds of groups defined by ethnic, national, racial, colonial, or sexual status. In Central and Eastern European scholarship, for example, abstract national communities, nations, have long been treated as history's actors, or at least as history's motivating force. In each of these cases, we risk confusing identities with identifications. We may think that we know a woman, or a peasant, or a Slovene when we meet one. But how do we, as historians, know that this woman, this peasant, or this Slovene is acting as a woman, a peasant, or a Slovene? How do we know that she identifies herself in this way, or what these categories mean to her? It's not surprising that we treat identities as if they were identifications. It is so much easier, and most of us are historians, so we've all had this difficult experience. It's just so much easier to find evidence that conceptualizes historical actors as identities, rather than to find evidence that shows us how or why people engaged in a process of identification. And yesterday I learned that postcards might be the exception to this. Moreover, there's also considerable evidence that the prior existence of categories of identity shapes the way people choose identifications. As I see it, the intention of this conference, and of you, its many presenters, is to think about how we might move away from this confusion of identities with identifications, away from this confusion of categories with historical actors. At the same time, however, we also want to examine how these two phenomena do relate to each other. Because as different as identity and identification are, they are, of course, very much related to each other. Let me mention some of the obvious difficulties involved with separating identifications from identities while we try to understand how they relate to each other. So we're pulling them apart at the same time as we're trying to see how they're together. So one danger, and I've done this myself, one danger is that we will see the relationship between these two categories in very simplified binary terms. There's a danger that we will define identifications as real or authentic experiences that come from below, on the one hand, and that we'll define identities as merely invented categories of identity that were imposed on people from above, say by the state or by scientists. Actually, scientists are usually the people who invent these categories. This model sees identification as a form of real human agency from below that struggles against the imposition on people of categories of identity from above. But a binary model that contrasts identification to identity is too simplistic a way to understand the complex relations between people and how they see themselves. And of course, we're all historians, right? So everything has to be more complicated, not less complicated. The process by which people choose to identify themselves involves their active engagement. This process is always a negotiated one, and not simply an imposition from above, or an assertion from below. And as a side note, I will say that I learned this very much from studying the history of sexuality and the history of the ways in which, in the late 19th century, categories of sexual behavior became cataloged by sexologists at the same time as they were adopted by people in society, and the conflicts and negotiations that went into that process, which, by the way, is a very difficult process to study. Another problem, because there's lots of problems here, is that scientists focus too much attention on the content of the identity, and they pay too little attention to the situation that produces the choice of identification. So if we want to learn more about how or why people identify themselves in their social engagements, we have to stop making identities themselves so central. We need to focus more on the situations that produce these choices of identification. After all, when does it matter that one sees oneself as Slovene? Whatever content that identity might hold. And when does it not matter? When we focus our attention on the content of identities, rather than on the situations, we find that identity by itself is not adequate to describe the full range of human identifications. So, to solve this problem, we invent new terms like hybrid identity, multiple identities, or fluid identities. And again, I'm not making fun of them because I've used them all myself, but they actually don't solve any problems. In fact, I think it's not the identities that are multiple or hybrid or fluid. It's the situations that produce these identity choices that are multiple, fluid, or hybrid. I don't think that we need to add to the term identity simply because someone appears to express 2 or 3 different or contradicting identifications. Instead, we need to examine the situations, the circumstances that produce those contradictory or multiple choices. To me, the great virtue of the papers at this conference is the way that they do precisely that. They focus on situation, on locality, on context, rather than making identity or authenticity itself into their subject. For many years now, I've tried in my own work to move my own focus away from the identities and instead to ask that question: what kind of situations in history made some identities popular at a certain moment? In what situations did people choose to act as nationalist people? And this shift requires us to historicize some of our most deeply held beliefs about our individuality. I learned this in my own encounter, again, with histories of gender and sexuality. This kind of work generally makes historians unpopular with governments and with the general public. Our work demonstrates to everyone, from governments to other social scientists, to society in general, that the most personal certainties to which everyone feels attached are actually not so certain. All of our certainties are possible identities. All of them have histories. Therefore, all of them have changeable meanings. Being a Slovene, being a woman, being a peasant, all of these categories have histories. They are not unchanging categories throughout time. But if these categories do have histories, they're not reliable certainties. They are products of historical developments that could have developed differently. Nothing is sacred to us historians. If the national identity has a recent history, for example, and it did not exist through all time, then how can it do its work to legitimate today's nation state? As historians, we know that we are doing our jobs well when we are unpopular, especially with government authorities of all kinds, and not just in Budapest or St. Petersburg. Of course, at the same time, we historians are in great demand by all kinds of government authorities seeking historical legitimation for their programs. Our status as experts can reinforce state mythologies and identities that allegedly hold together societies and regimes. And I think we can all think of examples of historians who have even become successful politicians or even presidents. I learned some of these lessons when I tried to research the self-identification of people in some nationally disputed regions of the Habsburg monarchy, one of which, the region of Lower Styria that we also heard about yesterday, a region not far from here, was the object of bitter political conflict among Slovene and German nationalists in the late 19th century. While doing the research for that book, I came to see that for many people in the 19th and early 20th centuries, identification with a nation depended on many factors, not simply one's language use or one's descent. Some people, I learned, saw no useful purpose at all in identifying with a nation. Many others identified with a nation in some situations, but not in others. Some people changed their identification from one nation to another, and they did not seem to see a contradiction there. Almost no one held a consistent view on this matter. Moreover, the very meaning of nation changed radically during the 19th and 20th centuries. I would say really just about every 5 or 10 years, even as the nationalists claimed that the nation was unchanging. So if all of this was true, how could we treat nations as real definable groups of people who had been actors in history? How could we say the Slovenes wanted this, the Germans thought that? When I did that work, I treated nationhood as a developing category of identification, produced largely by nationalist activists who saw in it primarily political possibilities. By the way, if you know this book, Guardians of the Nation, or any of my work, you'll see that I actually contradict everything I'm telling you now, because I've created a category called nationalist activists. And they are the kind of unchanging, identity-bound people that don't get the treatment I like to give all the rest of the people. But that's just an aside to show you my own weaknesses here. Okay. Now, the nationalists were keenly aware, those undifferentiated nationalists, that an identity was limited to formal political activity, say, voting at election time. That kind of political identity could never become deeply rooted or last very long. So for nationalists, the process of national identification had to be permanent, and it had to extend to all other parts of daily life. So in this demand, the nationalists tried to influence aspects of daily life that were not considered to be public or political, but were often considered to be private and intimate. Nationalist activists implored people to remember the nation in their personal economic choices, in their consumer choices, in the schools they chose for their children, and even in their religious lives or in their choice of a husband or wife. But it was precisely these more intimate demands that many people seemed to reject. They were willing to see themselves as part of a national group in some limited situations, but not in other situations. For them, a national identity meant something different from what it meant to the more committed nationalist activists. For the activists, people can never be nationalist enough, and that's true today. People's commitment is never strong enough. For nationalist activists, the work of making the nation, as Aiden Haidarpasic has pointed out, the work is never done. The nation is never forged. Now, obviously, my general argument here is not terribly new, and a lot of you have done a lot of work that uses these observations. And other people have made this argument about situation rather than identity, particularly the sociologist Rogers Brubaker. Although, interestingly, he has a very hard time applying these ideas to real historical situations. It's one thing to have a theory, it's another thing to act on it, as we all know. And I find this argument very difficult to act on. We cannot understand actions in history if we don't understand the personal meanings that abstract categories like nationhood held for people. And as I said, to understand those personal meanings, we need to focus much more on the situation that produced the identification and less on the identity itself. Now, when I say that the situation matters more than the identity, I also mean more than the complex local conditions and understandings of a situation, although they certainly are important. I also mean another element which is frequently left out of consideration, especially by nationalist historians, and that is the larger institutional context. And in my case, I'm going to make a plea for empire. This context means the institutions of empire. The imperial institutional context was highly important for shaping the identification choices that were available to most people. In particular, common imperial institutions, laws, judicial system, educational institutions, cultural practices, actively promoted some forms of identification over others. And of course, when I say empire didn't end in 1918. In fact, I think it was only the beginning. Empire continued in the administrative and cultural institutions of the successor states to the Habsburg monarchy. All of these states, I argue, shared many characteristics with the empire that had produced them, and I think we should call them empires and stop calling them by that other term, nation states. I can have that argument with other people later. It's a bit of a provocation. So, nationalists and nationalist historians, by the way, often write as if empire didn't even exist when it comes to explaining nations. Or empire and its institutions were obstacles to the development of nationalist identification. But in fact, empire and its institutions profoundly shaped and encouraged and produced the development of nationalist identifications in the 19th century. Empire and nation are not polar opposites. They are intimately entwined in a marriage of more than convenience, I think. We can only recognize the importance of imperial institutions if we take both the local and the imperial view of any historical situation. Both of these views, I believe, are fundamentally missing from the normal nationalist perspective that still dominates debates about identity. As all of you know, nationalist narratives and nationalist histories make national communities into historical actors. And in doing so, they marginalize the crucial local context, but also the crucial imperial context for understanding people's choices. Despite what nationalists tell us, concepts of nations, you've probably said this more than I have, concepts of nationhood were never expressions of existing nations. They were and are always assertions of potential nationhood, imaginings of what nationhood might someday mean in the future. The realization of the national community itself always lay and always lies in the future. And because nationalist histories focus so much on the nation and so little on either the imperial or the local, nationalists in Central Europe argued, for example, that the inspirational ideas about nationhood and national identity came to this region from Western societies, usually from France. France is sort of the origin point of everything in the universe, or at least Napoleon. Now, nothing against the French or the Enlightenment or Napoleon, but this claim that ideas of nationhood here were somehow awakened by nationalisms from the West enabled nationalists and historians to ignore completely the local traditions and the imperial institutions that, in my opinion, were responsible for the kinds of nationhood that developed in this Alpine, Adriatic, Danube region. The idea that inspiration came from the West also feeds other myths of Central and Eastern European difference, which we also heard about yesterday, I think, such as claims of economic backwardness, claims of a democratic deficit in this region, or claims, my favorite, of an ethnic mosaic that determined all of history. During the Cold War, many social scientists, as you know, nurtured these same claims as a way to distinguish what they called Western capitalist democracy from what they called Eastern communist dictatorship. But these claims had developed long before the Cold War. We can trace them at least to the day when the Habsburg, well, we don't know that day, but the moment when the Habsburg monarchy collapsed, because it really happened over a period of weeks, to the moment it collapsed into regional empires in the fall of 1918. Propagandists of the successor states often referred to the empire using that famous term, Volkerkerker, or the prison of the peoples, in order to distinguish the memory of that state from their new states. Empire, they said, was the opposite of nationhood. It was the opposite of the new, the future-oriented, the modern, the democratic. Empire had retarded economic, political, and above all, national development. And as I've argued elsewhere, the successor states were in fact the prisons of the people. But that's a different argument. Now, recent and not so recent research on the Habsburg Empire and the successor states calls into question all of these presumptions about the relationship between empire and nation. In fact, many historians argue the very opposite. Empire and its institutions created the particular understandings of nationhood that nationalists asserted in 1918. Empire contributed a great deal to the building of those national communities that the nationalists claim sprang up independently. In fact, ideas about nationhood, national identities, were largely the product of local people's engagement with imperial educational institutions and imperial state-building efforts. To see where the Habsburg monarchy came to define and even encourage the rise of nationhood, one only has to examine its laws and practices around questions of linguistic policy, language use. These policies that, again, have ably been written about by many of you, these policies created both the rhetorical and the political spaces that enabled nationalists to make claims on empire. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, it was largely Habsburg pragmatism and, as always, budgetary problems that encouraged the use of vernacular languages in local primary schools, in local religious practice, or when decrees had to be made public, even under centralizing rulers like Joseph II. In the mid-19th century, however, these pragmatic practices became reformulated and newly understood as fundamental constitutional rights of citizenship. In fact, they came to be understood as human rights. In 1848, and again in 1867, this constitutional validation of a multilingual practice at the level of the village school or the military regiment offered political activists a range of claim-making possibilities in an age of mass politics. Because, of course, a constitution can promise something, but in reality, that promise needs to be realized. And so there are a lot of court cases starting in the 1860s around this issue. The 1848 Kremsier draft on the rights of citizenship, the Austrian fundamental laws of 1867, and the Hungarian nationalities law of 1868, which is terribly important, and the later regimental rules about language for the military, for example, each of these made language use into a powerfully effective force for political claim-making and political mobilization. Over time, differences in language offered a legal basis to demand new forms of political autonomy, based first on language use and later on strange ideas about culture and nationhood that grew out of ideas about language. In an age of municipal autonomy and mass politics, arguments about nationhood also gave politicians effective tools to attract new voters from different classes and different regions. These tools worked, at least they did at election time, because they allowed politicians to link something as personal as fairness or victimization in your language use to a host of other issues. We might characterize the demands of political activists in 1848 and then again in the 1860s as a kind of identity building from below, where activists assert a shared identity that the state has already implicitly validated. So a lot of this activism is from below. But there's even more to this process than the assertion of linguistic rights. There's always more. Starting in the mid-19th century, the Habsburg state itself, like other European states, sought to make its diverse populations more legible to the growing bureaucracy and to the government. The state sought to organize the population on paper in ways that made it easier to manage society or reform society. The state itself needed to increase its knowledge about local populations because the reforms of the 18th and 19th century, especially the end of the rural feudal system, abolished the powers of those people who had always served as the source of that knowledge, the local nobility. Local nobles had administered local justice and local society. They had been the link between state and locality. But now, the formerly powerful local gentries were replaced with bureaucrats and elected institutions of self-rule. And those new institutions needed knowledge about local populations. So in 1869, the Austrian state carried out its first census, as well as a land mapping survey of its territories that's even still in use today. Now, as you know, the first census didn't attempt to measure people's language use. That practice in Imperial Austria began with the second census in 1880. But nevertheless, as Wolfgang Göderle has recently shown, the 1869 census went a long way to converting a socially diverse population into sets of comparable numbers by slotting people into categories equivalent to those used in other national censuses. The census categories measured all kinds of differences among people, and in doing so, created new social ideas about forms of difference, new identities. Men, women, children, urban, rural, different occupations, degrees of property ownership, educational level, access to citizenship, access to welfare benefits, all of these things. And in doing so, the census created the common categories by which society would be understood in the abstract. Later, when questions of language usage were added to the Austrian and Hungarian censuses, they too created categories to which political and national activists tailored their appeals. These were the so-called ethnic boxes to which Rockstergar and Tamara Scher have most recently referred as crucial to perpetuating certain categories of identification. These boxes, as many historians have pointed out, inadvertently created the ethnic or national categories, which became understood as real groups of people. Now, how should we understand the development of these categories of identity and identification? Should we see this process as a form of state building from above? Is this a kind of state imposition that then determines the choices of individual people? Does this process of categorization contrast to the kind of state building from below that I discussed a little bit earlier, where it was activists who used these institutional categories to achieve their own political goals? In this case, I think we need to consider what we mean by the state. We don't have to talk about that today. That, in turn, will help us to rethink the dichotomy that I've set up between state building from above and state building from below. It will allow us to assess whether these terms are even useful. One thing, though, that I think Wolfgang Göderle's work reminds us of very clearly is these categories, real people struggled to make the many decisions that created these categories that appeared on the census. It was not a simple process, and it involved many people at many levels of the state. Real people determined how these categories would be applied, and once the information was gathered, how they would be interpreted and analyzed. They determined how questions about identification would be asked and then analyzed. There is no faceless state here, but rather state employees at several levels, often with some training in early ethnography, who are charged with creating systems to accomplish these goals. So while the flow of discourse about categories may appear to be Foucauldian in its reach into all areas of society, in fact, it was negotiated and renegotiated by individual people as they tried to define their own place in the system. So while we could think of this process in terms of a kind of domination, where the state creates categories of identification and then people are forced into them, I think that that's a terrible simplification. Seeing these processes in terms of a top-down domination or a bottom-up agency misses the dynamic process by which they function through negotiation, personally, at every level. Institutions are the products of people's actions, but institutions, once they are founded, are never applied in an abstract, clear manner, but rather experience their own subtle modifications through daily processes of negotiation in their application. The continuous engagement of local people with imperial institutions as they pursue their own politics changes those institutions, often imperceptibly, but sometimes radically. What all of this should suggest, besides being super complicated, is that even my own terms, institutionalizing difference from above and below, that was, by the way, the title of my talk, even these terms are completely misleading and way too binary in nature. So let me leave this topic in its unfinished nature to further discussion. It seems clear to me, in conclusion, that the move to make context and situation into our historical subject, rather than allowing identity to be our historical subject, will at least produce a greater emphasis on identification rather than on identity. And that can only be useful to our field. I really applaud the organization of this conference and the focus it puts on identification and the clear distinction it makes between identification and identity, because I think the work of the historian is in the direction of identification. But I also hope that in featuring the local, we can link it effectively to the transregional, or what I call the imperial, because it's this link between local and imperial, or local and transregional, that the national histories have always left out. And restoring our view of them may help us to develop analytic narratives that are both different, but that also persuade the public. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Peter, again. We still have 20 minutes for discussion, so please, short and pointed questions.
We need a few
minutes to breathe in. Clemens, please.
Thanks for your inspiring lecture, Peter. I was wondering, for example, the openings in there will be a clear tool of soft power to kind of establish a sort of ethnographic national take on the monarchy coming from the center, being unionist, being politically correct on the left, because in a way it has always this Leibniz idea that every people has its position within the empire. So there are, even the gypsies are basically painted in a kind of favorable way. There's a silent ranking, but still kind of, everybody has his or her function. So would this be kind of state-building from above, or what?
Actually, the Kronprinzenwerk is one of my favorite examples because it is so complicated and can't be read in a single way. So yes, on the one hand, the whole idea of a project that in volumes shows you the extent of the empire and the peoples of the empire and catalogs them is a remarkable attempt, I think, to impose a certain kind of vision of empire. On the other hand, who writes the articles? I hate to say it, but nationalists. So here, it's also a perfect example of nation and empire working together to produce something that helps both of them. On the other hand, there are implicit hierarchies, I agree with you, and I agree with you especially about what's called the gypsies, but they're not the only ones at the bottom of the hierarchy. On the other hand, the hierarchy is constantly being displaced, I think. And the problem is that, in one sense, the laws and, the laws of the monarchy promote a certain vision of the relationship of peoples and languages, and the actual social practice relates a different vision. So certain kinds of equality are clear to the law and to the judges, let's say, who determine the many cases about language use that are brought to them. But on the other hand, this idea of an empire putting many people together and a civilizing mission where the people who are backwards are helped by the people who are not backward is also completely promoted at the same time. This is why I think we have to be really careful that we don't marginalize too much the legal questions when we look at the cultural questions, for example. But yeah, the Kronprinzenwerk is endlessly interesting in precisely this regard.
Dan, please.
So, a question about the situation. How do you avoid reading it teleologically? And how do you avoid, this is the outcome, so this was therefore secure. How do you avoid that problem? I mean, one of the things quite interesting is Wolfgang was doing a thing on violence. And he said, the problem with violence is that we ascribe motives to people after the event, but when these things are taking place, people are not doing them with explicit motivations. They're doing it because it happens to be a space in which they break down and things like this. So, and then afterwards we say, yes, that was a national awakening, that was that, and how do we avoid this situation?
It's a constant struggle because we live in societies, in a world in which teleologies legitimate the current political regimes, and they are promoted, and they are also very persuasive. People like to read stories with the outcome that show them where their lives are in the present. So I think our job is constantly to undermine these teleologies. But how do you read these things? So from my own experience, when I set out to write the book about the meaning of local nationalism in these linguistically mixed regions, the first thing I did was look for all newspaper accounts in a given year of violent incidents. Because I thought, if I find a moment of violence, then I'm going to find some sort of true, authentic moment of conflict. And of course, that was the opposite of what I found. It's exactly as you say it. The violence occurs for many complex reasons, and we only can understand them in the most local, situational way. But even then, I couldn't understand what caused most of these situations of violence. But what was clear was how opportunistically any moment of violence was then reinterpreted by media and historians and politicians. And then each moment of violence comes to symbolize something that reinforces the teleology you were talking about. So I think the way we have to do it is actually to become, at the same time, ethnographers, but also people aware of the big context, just as I was arguing before, not so much the middle context. I mean, even seeing it in terms of levels is completely wrong, probably. But I think that's why this work that's being done on local context is so critical. Because we can take so many incidents that we think we understand and re-understand them in new ways. Just one more quick part of this answer. I also learned that an incident of violence, the nationalists always said violence is when the normal nationalist feeling just can't be held back anymore, and people are so angry that for this reason, that they commit acts of violence. So I was always looking to see in daily life, where are the other signs of that nationalist feeling that should be there if, everyone's ready to kill each other in a moment of violence. And I could never find them. So I think if we can't find them, we have to admit that we can't find them. But I think the teleological view is something we all struggle against, and I think with identities and identifications, we live in societies in which it's incredibly important that all of these identities be fixed and stable. And of course, our own personal experience shows us that they're not. And I think historians do the work of taking that personal experience and showing how on a larger level, it's in fact the case over time.
Thank you very much for the wonderful lecture. I would like to know, in your understanding of the context, which is the role of the other states as geopolitical actors and or as model for the national activists on the ground?
I think that in my work, I have almost never mentioned that the other states have a role, but they do. I'll just say that. But I think, again, being careful about these teleological narratives to understand the role of the other states is really problematic, and that it's not simple. Other states function often as examples with which local people will say, here it's being done differently there, and we should have this, they have that, and we don't. Between Austria and Hungary, there's an enormous amount of exchange and networking in terms of activism, political activism of all kinds, from socialism to nationalism. But I wouldn't even say necessarily other states, often other regions. But just to answer, because I know your particular region that you look at, the question of Italian irredentism, the meaning of Italianness to people is quite problematic for historians, I think. But there are many ways in which the Italian state is not something that some Italian speakers in parts of Austria would like to become a part of, particularly the anti-Catholic state policies and the anti-Catholicism of many of the sort of national liberal activists. So I think we have to see exchange beyond national borders, obviously. But we have to recognize that it isn't always about what we expect to find. That's a stupid statement. Nothing ever is. Sorry.
I wonder if this competition between the heads of the Austrian Office of Statistics and the Russian Office of Statistics, German wouldn't be read as one of these contingencies which demand the theology, because Czerny, if I remember it correctly, recognized languages as existing, but didn't recognize Beck's insistence that one person can have only one language, and basically Czerny, if I once again remember correctly, was older, infirmary, and eventually he died, so Beck could be successful at the statistical congress in St. Petersburg in 1871, when it was accepted as the Holy Writ, and it became the Holy Writ of nationalism. If we remember about it, out of sudden you don't have this theological reading of language must identify the person. I don't know, I just kind of have remembered the story. So.
You're way too modest, since you've written a rather substantial book that I think shows very clearly this point. Yes, I was going to put it slightly differently, but simply to say that the development of certain kinds of international standards then shapes the way in which the census and its meaning, first of all, the way it's created, and secondly, how it's analyzed. So absolutely, the idea that one person can only know one language, which becomes a European standard, creates an enormous teleology. Now, I would like to say, if they had allowed the possibility of more than one language, that doesn't mean we wouldn't have nationalism. We certainly would, but it would be then directed in a slightly different way, and it would have a different teleology and a different story. So yes, I agree. And also because if you think about it, for Hungarian nationalists, it was very important to measure second language knowledge, because the second language was always going to be Hungarian, and it would sort of prove that Magyarization actually was happening. So yes, these are really critical contingencies that then shape the look of what nationalism can be. It shapes the spaces of where nationalists can make their arguments effectively.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting talk, and I like this idea of the process of identification, because it sounds a little bit kind of like the Renault's idea of the daily plebiscite, because it's an active process that we're creating. I'm kind of curious, where is there a role, just kind of looking from my own perspective, in unintentional or natural features in creating these daily decisions or identifications, because not everyone's idea to feel a certain way comes from someone else's active efforts to make them feel that way.
You mean it might come from a river?
It may.
No, I fully agree. I think that's the point. So I didn't talk about environment. I talked about imperial institutions because that's what I'm into at the moment. But when we say context, I think we have to understand context in the broadest possible way. Otherwise, we're not getting a clear picture of why decisions are made in certain ways. And I mean, the points that you were bringing up yesterday about local or even networks of economic concerns, of course, could play an enormous role in shaping. In fact, I was going to ask you, why isn't the regulation of the Danube a Hungarian prestige project in the 19th century? And it seems to me, from what you said, that it can't be, because for too many local towns, that regulation could be problematic. So it's not going to be a national sort of...
Or they just didn't have the money for it.
Well, yeah, no one in the Habsburg monarchy ever has enough money. But anyway, yes.
We still have 5 minutes, and there's time for a couple of questions, I think. Oh, sorry.
Out of your purview. Well, so thank you very much, for this. I feel much more uneasy about identifying as a historian. I see that as an identification rather than a permanent identity. So I just wanted to tease out this point that you hinted at, and one that you suspect of being quite controversial about the 20th century empires and its successor states behaving as empires. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about that. How should we conceptualize this? How should we understand it? Is it are we sort of thinking about fragments of the kind of institutional, residual institutions in the 20th century and how they're reused by the successor states? Are we thinking about practices of managing difference? And then finally, I guess, are some successor states more imperial in their behaviors than others? And I fancy that states like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia are, because they simply have more difference to manage and try to live in a more latitudinarian way. But
that's actually a good question, and as you're asking it, I'm thinking, well, of course, Czechoslovakia has that wonderful colony, Subcarpathian Ukraine, which I think I want more people to be writing about. But to me, the biggest empire is Romania. So already, the state that has the anxieties of an empire, and in the classic sense. The difficulty with making this argument also, by the way, is that you then have, people will say, well, what's an empire? And I don't want to answer that question. My preference is that we don't even talk anymore about nation states or empires, because I think this is an ideological distinction that serves very little analytic purpose. I think that nation state is a term we can use because we see these states describing themselves in this way. And I also think that it produces a way of managing cultural difference that ends very badly in the Second World War and today. And we're stuck with it. Because we think nation states are the most stable kinds of states, so somehow we want to validate every situation that
this
pure...
is Scotland, you'll get a different
But in any case, my point also is that it's been explored in the specific historiographies. In other words, we know a lot from, say, Czechoslovakia or Yugoslavia about the specific administrative institutions that were taken over and not even changed, let's say. The educational institutions, the cultural institutions, that we know about, but we've never taken all this knowledge and put it together. And that, I think if we were to do that, we would find that there's an enormous similarity among all of these states in this regard, and they share there's much more continuity. Now, the continuity, in my opinion, breaks down in the 30s, but in the 20s, I think it's very powerful. I would also say one more thing, which is I think cultural management of cultural difference is very much inherited from empire. But under new political structures, that way of managing difference loses its balance and becomes really dangerous. That would be my thing about that. Yeah.
I get Poland to the list. Besides Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, Poland.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mention all of them. The one that everybody always says, well, Hungary can't have been an empire because they lost everything. And, well, I think in terms of cultural attitudes, values, and institutions, yeah.
If it's a quick one, Linus.
Yeah, just a reaction. We should not forget that all so-called nation states that emerged as successor states were multi-ethnic too. So basically,
Yes.
it was the greatest humility of the 20th century. Woodrow Wilson had in mind, kind of, solve a problem like this. Just creating smaller nation, multi-ethnic states that were settled with the same problems and solved them in a more radical and more intimate.
May I just add, as a last thing, that a lot of what I said this morning, I think most of you are already using and thinking about. And I think it's difficult for all of us as historians, especially when we speak publicly, because I feel in one sense I'm telling you things you already know and you're already doing. But I also think that we're saying things that the general public doesn't understand. And I think it's really critical, this is why I ended with the statement, for us to find very persuasive ways of creating persuasive narratives that could be understood and adopted more generally and publicly. And it may be impossible, but I think that always creates a tension for us of speaking to specialists and then making the general points that we all already know, but unfortunately always need to be made.